her slides. That's great, I can see that. So I'm absolutely delighted to introduce one of my PhD students here at CRELLA, Gwen Cauldwell. Gwen had studied with us part-time, distance-based for a while, and while working full-time at different testing organizations. And during her course of study, she has overcome many challenges, like moving internationally and becoming a mother. And as a mother of young children myself, I can see how hard it is sometimes to juggle full-time work, childcare, housework, and on top of that, PhD study. So I am full of admiration to Gwen, and yeah, I'm really super proud. So without further ado, I'm going to pass over to Gwen. So Gwen has successfully defended her thesis recently, and she's now almost done with her corrections. So yeah, this is our successful candidate. So Gwen, over to you.
Okay, great. Thanks, Chihiro. Can you hear me okay?
We can indeed. We can hear you nice and clearly. Thank you.
Okay, good. You can't see me because my camera's been funky, but there we go. All right, so as Chihiro mentioned, I'm Gwen Cauldwell, and I'm going to be talking you through my research on the spoken production of young learners aged 13 to 15. And today I'm going to briefly give you a bit of a background to the study, why I decided to look into this in the first place, cover the main research questions in the study, how I decided to approach answering those main questions, and really then focus more importantly on some of the key findings. It's probably worth mentioning now that this study has two main focuses, one which is looking at the spoken characteristics of young learners, and also probably the secondary one is the validation of aptitude tasks. But for the purposes of this presentation, I'm going to focus a lot more on the characteristics and what some of the results highlighted there, and then how we might think about implications of that for the future, and further research that could be done around this. So in terms of background for the study, way back when I was a teacher, I was always quite interested in teaching teenagers and enjoyed it, contrary to a lot of my colleagues, to be honest. And I always thought they were a little bit special and just needed some support to be able to do their best. And I sometimes feel that, or felt certainly in the past, that they're often viewed as almost being adults, so we can teach or test them that way. And there's a growing demand really for teens tests, as more and more people are taking English language tests. And some of those examples are the for School Suites from Cambridge, TOEFL Junior, and of course Aptis for Teens. And I was also part of the Aptis Teens task development, and really wanted to understand all the work that we put in to try and localize those tasks, whether that bore out operationally, and to see whether some of the changes we made were successful in supporting those teenagers in doing their best. And more widely, there's a lot of research, as we know, around adults and their spoken production. There's quite a bit now, not enough, but quite a lot around younger learners, more specifically sort of 9 to 11. There's still a bit of a gap really around what teenagers are up to. And there's some emerging research around the social, cognitive and linguistic development. And it'd be good for me to try and identify some of those characteristics that you might plot on that continuum of what is happening with teenagers in their spoken performance, and how we might think about that when designing test tasks for them. So that's a little bit of the background. And here are my three main research questions, which I'm not going to read out individually for you, but you will notice that the top one is quite meaty, because there are four main groups involved in this research study. That's adult native speakers, adult non-native speakers, teens, native speakers, and not teens, non-native speakers. And the idea here really was to be able to compare adult spoken performance to teenagers to see what the differences were, but also with native speakers. So if, for example, a teen non-native speaker group was approaching the task in a certain way or had certain characteristics that were evidenced, were these also present with native speaker teenagers? And that would help kind of tease out the derivation of those characteristics, whether they are related to cognitive development at that age rather than anything to do with language learning, for example. So here is the overview of my approach. You've got the 4 distinct groups at the top, and these 4 groups are taking the same 2 B2 test tasks. You'll hear me say task 4 and task 5 a lot probably as we go through. So task 4 is a task designed for adults, and the second one is a task designed specifically for teenagers. It's probably worth mentioning here that the adult task was also selected, ensuring that the topic was suitable for teenagers so that there wasn't any undue influence there. And then there are 3 main areas of analyses. The one designed to answer the research question 1, which was about which characteristics contributed most to the overall score. Here I applied multiple regression analysis to be able to understand that. Secondly, for the spoken characteristics across group, I looked at complexity, accuracy, and fluency measures. And then lastly, there was rater cognition analysis, so stimulated recall, where raters listened to some of the candidates again and then talked through their thoughts whilst they were rating them. So here we have the adult task, just to give you an idea of what they were doing. This is a fairly typical B2 adult task with 3 questions that the candidates have to answer in an extended response, with the questions getting a little bit more abstract as you go through. And obviously they have a bit of preparation time as well, so that they can gather their thoughts beforehand and prepare what they're going to say. And here is the teens task, and you'll notice it's quite a bit more colourful and there's a lot more going on here. So you don't need to be able to read all of the words, don't worry, but at the top you've got a fairly hefty instruction there, which is quite clearly telling the candidates what we expect of them and what we would like them even not to do. And this was to be able to support them. It remains on screen throughout the task so that they are reminded and can stay a little bit focused. It doesn't always guarantee that they will, but it is there to help them. And then the idea is that they're giving a poster presentation to their group, and they need to cover all of the points that are in the poster, preferably in their own words. And there's a fair bit of analysis that I did looking into the amount of reliance that the groups had on these bullet points to get through the task, which I'll discuss a little bit later when I get to that stage. Yes, but that's the task, to give you an idea. So here are sort of the key results from the multiple regression analysis. There are around 250 candidates that were used, their scores, so the overall score, and then a analytic score was assigned. So I should mention that in order to do this, I took the guided holistic scales from APTIS and turned them into analytic scales, and the raters re-rated using those scales to be able to assign scores for each part of performance. So I've highlighted here for each group the parts of performance that were significant in their contribution to the score, and I guess the main bit here is that there is a difference. There's a difference across the tasks, and there's also a difference across groups into which parts contribute to the overall score. Something that was particularly interesting and perhaps slightly confusing for me because I don't know why, but it is interesting that pronunciation for the teens groups is the one that came out up top there. It's interesting given that at this level, pronunciation, perhaps there aren't as many errors at B2 level. You're largely expecting them to be able to be clear and comprehensible as they go through, which they were. So it's interesting that it worked out this way. And if you've got any ideas around that, I would love to hear them. Whereas, for example, if you look at task 5 with the adult group, pronunciation hardly contributes at all to the overall score. It's got a negative correlation there, which I would expect it to turn out that way more. Okay, so we'll move on to the CAF measures, and you'll notice that there are fewer candidates here that I looked at, and that's because I selected those who had a score of 4, which is B2 in this task, and those with a score of 6 for comparison purposes. So 6 is a C1, and obviously because I was using native speakers, most of them got a 6, so to be able to use them in the comparison, I needed to be able to look at that score as well. I did conduct a pilot study looking at a wider range of CF measures than this to be able to select those which were relevant for the study, those which were correlating a little bit more to the scores. So, for example, I ended up choosing VOC-D over TTR, speech rate over articulation rate. And there weren't that many errors. I'd looked at sort of mean accuracy measures, but it wasn't providing useful in the pilot study, so I didn't look at them in the larger study. I've highlighted for you the idea units here, which is probably the more interesting bit, that gives a few examples around teenage spoken characteristics. And for those of you who aren't familiar with idea units, then it is the way that candidates convey, and in particular here it's the points in the poster. So these 8 points would then be 8 idea units, and looking at how the candidates convey that. So if it's an individual idea unit, it might be word for word, for example, and combined means that they're using some of the words directly and then others, or whether they're kind of paraphrasing it more, for example. And then the bottom 3 idea units there are looking more at task fulfillment. So whether they introduce the presentation, any kind of introduction was awarded, whether they extend, so whether they provide some of their additional information or their own ideas, and whether they are successfully paraphrasing some of the information that's there, which is directly linked to the expectations set out in the task and in the instructions at the top. So some brief highlights of the CAF measures. I mean, there's a lot more within that, but just to give you an idea. Something that was interesting is that overall, the mean CAF measures were higher in task 5 than task 4. So in particular with number of words, AS units causes VOC-D and speech rate. So that suggests that task 5 in general, and that's with both adults, teenagers, native and non-native speakers, elicited more language, which might suggest that it's quite a good task at that B2 level. It's giving you language 2 rate at least, which is good. In terms of the idea units and content reduction, so teenagers were reproducing word for word the bullet points more so than adults. So you'll see there non-native speaker teenagers who scored 6, 81% of word for word reproduction, as opposed to adults who were around 50%, 57.1 and 50% respectively. So more of a reliance with the teenagers on word for word reproduction of those idea units. It was similar for combined, and then with macro propositions, which is where they have to be expanding a little bit more. Obviously, that was higher with adults, for example, than it was teenagers. So that was quite interesting. And then if we look a little bit more at the task fulfillment side of things, adults were providing an introduction more than teens, and that's possibly due to life experience. Adults are a little bit more used to doing presentations perhaps than teenagers, and so they launch into some sort of introduction beforehand. Doesn't mean that teenagers can't do it, they just did it less frequently. And maybe perhaps a little bit of a limitation to the study here. All of the participants extended, so that means that they elaborated a bit on the bullet points. However, the way that I was capturing this meant that if they did it once, then it was classed as them having extended. So it maybe isn't a full picture. It shows that teens are able to elaborate, but probably not as often as adults, and that's something that would be good to go back to and dig around a little bit more. When looking at this extension in particular, so how teenagers elaborated on some of these bullet points versus adults, teenage attempts were a little less sophisticated. And I've got an example of this here for you, just to illustrate a little bit what I mean. So we've got 2 candidate transcripts here. The top one is an adult non-native speaker, and they are providing a little bit more of information and extending on the bullet point around there being 1.5 million people who live on their own in the UK. And you can see that I mean, it's quite succinct. It's clear they're giving a reason as to why this might be. And underneath here, you've got a non-native speaker teenager who's also providing additional information around how you could help the elderly. But it's sort of, it's not as succinct, it's not as clear. There's a bit of repetition, so learning of helping and helping them. Elderly people are really good because they've got lots of time to do stuff. So it's not quite as sort of clear and succinct perhaps as the adult one. It doesn't mean they can't do it, but it's a little less sophisticated. And so finally, I was just going to touch upon some of the stimulated recall results. What was interesting and came through quite strongly is that the scales were largely very well internalized and applied by the raters. For task 5, though, there was a bit of an overlap in the descriptors around task fulfillment and cohesion, and that might be something worth kind of revisiting and picking out a little bit there. Something that also was borne out, but probably I'm not the first. There's quite a bit of research around this. I'm not the first to find out that raters are a little bit harsher with native speaker candidates, and also the higher scoring adult candidates. And I've got a bit of an example of that on the next slide for you. Something that was a little puzzling is that grammatical complexity was referred to quite a bit by the raters. They certainly felt that there was evidence of it. So you get a lot of comments from the raters saying, oh, grammar's good. Yeah, that's fine. I'll give them a 5. Oh, yes, that there were no problems there. It's all quite positive around it. But when you actually looked at the transcripts, I struggled to find a lot of evidence of complex grammar structures. So it's quite interesting that the raters didn't necessarily hone in on it, or weren't searching for it or just assumed it was there. And to be fair, with both of these tasks, you can get through by just using, for example, the present simple. So maybe it's just a task effect that raters are not necessarily expecting something too complex there, and are satisfied with what they do get. But that's definitely something worth considering and looking at. And lastly, again, the raters, when I did some kind of broader questions with them at the end of the stimulated recall interviews, there was a definite feeling that teens were not great at elaborating, or they were a bit repetitive, for example, or talked in circles. And I found it quite interesting that raters referred a lot to teens speak, that's what they called it, which is the way that teens are obviously speaking during the task. So I've got an example response here of one of the adults. So this is adult non-native speaker. And the first bit that I've highlighted on the left is how this candidate has transformed a little bit of the information, really, or paraphrased it in their own words on the bullet point of by 2050, over 20% of the world will be over 60 years old, and they've changed 20% to a fifth of the world. And this particular bullet point was at times problematic for teenagers. So there are several examples of adults being able to convey this in different ways, saying by, halfway through the century, for example, instead of by 2050. There was a lot of different things that they did, whereas teenagers struggled in particular with this one, and that was quite interesting, to the point that with teenagers there are a lot of disfluencies when approaching this one, and even if they tried, sometimes they would give up and just read it word for word. So that's one that really might be difficult, really, cognitively for teenagers at this stage. It really showed some interesting things there. And then the other bit that I just wanted to highlight to my earlier point was the rater comments here around this candidate's performance, where they've zoned in. So this candidate has scored a 6, which is C level, and they've discovered some issues with stress, for example. So they've knocked off a little point for them, and pausing and stresses, and some of it being quite flat, has made them, be a little bit harsher on this candidate. When I listen to them, and obviously it's only in my ears, and maybe I should play it to you all, I don't particularly notice any issues with stress or pausing or intonation. And in fact, having counted the pauses, there isn't, anything that sticks out or any great deal of difference compared to other candidates in this group. So that's just a little bit of an example for you as to harshness towards higher scoring adult candidates there. So as I mentioned, it was coming through from the raters of how they felt with teenagers and their inability perhaps to be as sophisticated or as clear and succinct as adults. And this is just a sort of example of some of their comments. So they feel that youngsters don't know what to say, beyond "I was happy, I love it." They can't quite expand on that. They feel that lack of experience, perhaps, is what's holding teenagers back in this kind of thing. They don't have that innate ability maybe that adults do. They know it's a test, and so you'll throw in your kind of third conditional to get an extra point. Teenagers might not yet be able to sort of think like that. Doesn't mean that applies to all of them, but it might happen and be a reason for that. And they feel that they're much shorter in their responses. They don't go into as much detail, and as mentioned before, you know, they've got this real feeling that they've got the knowledge, but they don't necessarily showcase it or expand as they should when speaking. And here I've just picked out a couple of examples of what I mean by repetition. And so we've got up the top left, we've got a native speaker teenager. So to show that this happens both with native and non-native speaker teenagers. And there's just the use of the same word. So you've got an overuse perhaps of maybe. So they scored a 6, which is also interesting. But you know, they don't expand on comfortable, for example, culture. There's other ways that you could say that to really push it and display range, which is what obviously raters are looking for, not just complexity but range as well. The same with the bottom transcript. So black, they are black. Legs look slimmer twice, and this repetitive nature. So I can do anything, I can run, I can jump, I can squat, I can do anything. It's almost a list, and talking in lists is recognized as a characteristic of younger children, but clearly it hasn't totally gone away with teenagers either. So I thought that was also an interesting one to think about. And so just general conclusions for you around this, that teenagers definitely can perform at B2 level, but it may not be as sophisticated as that of adults, especially there, as you see, with a bit of the repetition, the lack of ability to elaborate. And so this is something that worth considering, and I've just spotted my typo, that's great, with, you know, when we're designing tasks for teenagers, or something for raters to be aware of in rater training, and to think about with the scales perhaps. In terms of future studies, I think there's still a lot to do. A lot could be done with the data that I have, having a little bit more, replicating the study more, but being able to dig around comments and thoughts and evidence around that grammatical complexity side of things. You know, does it need to be in there if it isn't contributing that much, for example? And I think something else that would be really good to do would be to do a similar study, but looking at writing, because if these characteristics are the same in writing, that in itself would be interesting, but perhaps not. You know, perhaps teenagers don't write repetitively, and then maybe they showcase their other skills or the grammar more in writing. And if you're looking at a 4 skills test, for example, that might influence the way you would, you know, weight your scales and scoring accordingly. So yes, those are my sort of main suggestions and conclusions looking at the characteristics. There's a lot more that I haven't touched upon, and I'm more than happy to take questions now, or for people to align to me later as well.
Thank you, Gwen. Thank you so much, Gwen, for the presentation. Yeah, I always listen to great intent, although I was the supervisor. Okay, so we have a few clarification questions. So I'm not sure if we can go through them all, but let me choose maybe Yeah, 1 or 2. So why do you think task 5, the teens task, elicited more language and wider range of language than task 4? Do you have any insights to help task designers?
I think the support helped for sure. So they didn't have to do everything from scratch. So in terms of the bullet points, it was a bit clearer maybe what they had to do, and that will have helped them. And I also think it's a little bit more of a real life task, perhaps, as a presentation that people are more used to, rather than talking about slightly more abstract things. In particular with teenagers, they struggle with that abstract side of things, so having something a bit more concrete to talk to probably supported them there a lot, I would say.
Thank you. And yeah, relating to the task design, so this question about, do you think the subject matter of the task, the questions, had an impact, thinking in particular about how interested teens are in subject of aging population compared to perhaps fashion or dress in the other task?
Yeah, it's a good question, and it's really a difficult one with topic, because I think it's quite individual. You know, I could probably talk more about fashion than others, perhaps, and you might give me something else that somebody else in the room would love. So it's a difficult one, and I did trial them both beforehand to make sure that there didn't seem to be any undue influence. I tried 3 different topics for the teenagers as well, and made sure that I went for one that seemed to be working. But it's always hard to predict, because you know, Nahal can probably talk a lot more about background knowledge than I can, and how that influences the topic choice. But yes, it's definitely something that you've got to pay a lot of attention to for sure.
Yeah, thanks. Okay, so a couple of more classification questions. Could you say a little more about how cohesion was scored?
Ooh, so
do you want to maybe talk about this bullet point on cohesion?
Yeah, so it's, as I mentioned, it's a guided holistic scale. So it describes the overall performance in bullet points. So it will say that, for example, the pronunciation is largely intelligible. You know, the presentation is cohesive, for example, would be around cohesion. And then I actually split these separately. So for every score, there's a slightly different overall description. And so those were split out. It's quite hard to describe it actually without having it kind of in front of me, to be honest, because I'm not sure it needs a bit of a visual.
Okay, so I think I have maybe one more question, but I'm also conscious of the